I want to thank you all in advance for your grace around any technology issues tonight. This is our first experience bringing virtual training content that is open to the entire membership. As you can imagine, this means a lot of people have been working behind the scenes to get everything set up to enable us to have this meeting and many more as we move forward. We hope this goes off without a hitch, and I think it will, but please keep in mind we're still learning how all of this technology works. So just something to keep in mind. A couple of reminders up here. This webinar is going to be recorded. We recommend that you view it in speaker view. I think that'll help. And you'll be muted for the duration of this meeting as well. Should you have any questions, or wait, are we going to the next slide? Thank you. One more. All right, a couple of other key things to know about this meeting. You must have been pre-registered in order to receive a meeting credit. Only actives will receive a meeting credit, also something to keep in mind. You must be present within the first 15 minutes of the start of the meeting. Our tried and true 15-minute rule applies here, even virtually. You must remain in the meeting until the end of the scheduled meeting time. Please be sure to complete the survey shared at the end of the meeting, and meeting credits will be issued within 5 to 7 days. Again, this is a new process for us, so will not be instant, so please work with us on that if you don't mind. All right, the next slide. As we go through, if you've got questions, we have got folks in the chat who are ready to answer those questions. You can, if you have a question for the speakers, once they get started, you can ask our Diversity and Inclusion Chair, Lanasha House. If you have questions about the Junior League and the Diversity and Inclusion Plan or our plans going forward, you can ask Heather Bennett. Technical questions, Jennifer Johnson, and meeting credit questions, always very important, our Education Chair, Emily Somerville. All right. Keep those questions coming in the chat to those specific folks as you move forward. So summertime in the Junior League is typically a little bit of an off time. For many of us, it's a quiet time. But this year, as I know you can imagine, has proven to be anything but typical. The board, the strategy team, which includes our Diversity and Inclusion Committee and our Education Committee, have worked really hard to set up a 3-part series starting tonight to bring to light topics around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how we can all work to better ourselves and our community. We hope you find these sessions informative and thought-provoking. In addition to our summer series, the strategy team has put together a comprehensive diversity and inclusion action plan for our league for the year. We will now, I think we already have it up, a great graphic that shows you that comprehensive plan. As I mentioned, this is the first of our summer series. We'll have 2 additional diversity and inclusion summer series sessions, August 26th and September 23rd. You should have received an email detailing a little bit more about those, and we'll continue to send out more details as we move forward. In addition to the summer series, we'll be sharing a variety of resources on our internal and external websites. This will include things to read, listen to, watch, and even to help in having hard conversations with your kiddos. Also included in the plan are focus groups where you can share ideas on our diversity and inclusion initiatives for our members, staff, and the community. We are also working on updating our internal training materials, as well as offering training for members, such as our session tonight, conversations within our individual committees with our diversity and inclusion committee, and training for all of our staff and our leadership. We've been doing some great training, and we're continuing to move forward and improve it and grow it and expand it to a larger audience. We will continue to keep you updated on what's to come as we roll out updates. We hope you find something that works for you. We're committed to continuing this conversation throughout our year together, starting tonight. Now, moving on to our fabulous speakers. Tonight, we're honored to have two remarkable speakers joining us to open up our conversation about diversity, inclusion, and so much more. Both Ulysses and Michelle were slated to join us for our diversity and inclusion training track in the spring, which unfortunately we had to reschedule. But they were both gracious enough to come back for this very important conversation. With that, I want to thank you all for joining us. I want to thank Ulysses and Michelle. And I want to turn it over to our executive sponsor for diversity this year, Renita Smith, for the official introductions. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Evening, Junior League of Dallas. I am so excited about this summer series. As Elizabeth stated, the D&I committees and education and communication, the board have been working so hard to put together this action plan for our membership. And to kick this off with the Listen, Learn, and Now What with Ulysses Reeves-Waters and Michelle Kinder, I couldn't dream of a better team to have this conversation with. I'm going to give a really soft intro of these women because they are my mentors. Even if they don't know it yet, but I look up to them tremendously. Ulysses does such amazing work in the community, fighting for social justice as part of the Lone Star Justice Alliance as the deputy director. And she also has a wonderful membership at a local church, and just her spirit and passion for the work and the movement is unparalleled. Michelle Kinder is a speaker, a writer, and just an amazing human being as well. I've followed her journey in the background. I've had a chance to work with her over the course of this year, and just her compassion for understanding racial issues and having that level of empathy and understanding that we're all on a different part of this journey. So having these two together in this conversation, I think is going to be fantastic for us all to sit and witness. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ulysses. If you would love to introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Good evening, everyone. So glad to be here with you tonight and to be a part of this critical conversation with Junior League of Dallas. As Renita mentioned, I'm the Deputy Director for Lone Star Justice Alliance. We work to improve the lives of youth and emerging adults who are justice system involved. And we envision a Texas where youth and emerging adults are treated in a developmentally appropriate manner whenever they are involved in the justice system. We also take a public health approach to public safety, recognizing that many of the environmental factors that surround many of the folks who are justice system involved have really been the impetus for their justice system involvement. And if we impact those social determinants of health, those underlying issues, we are able to help folks get on another path of life. My background is kind of varied. I grew up in Dallas, native Dallasite, and grew up in an entrepreneurial family. We have a barbecue restaurant, Smoky John's Barbecue. Went on to law school, became a family law attorney, did family law for a while, and then wound up at the Dallas City Attorney's Office, where I began to get involved with community prosecution, and that is where my love for criminal justice reform began. And so I will stop there so that my dear, dear friend, Michelle Kinder, can tell you about herself as well.
Thank you, Renita and Ulysses, and thank you all for allowing me to be part of this tonight. I think in terms of bio, what feels relevant is to share with you all that my background is mental health and primarily preoccupied with children and their mental health. And not too far into that journey, it became clear to me that children can't thrive without healthy families, and families can't thrive without healthy communities. And healthy communities go toward structural racism, and they go toward making sure that there is opportunity for justice and equity. And I think that's one of the things that we're all doing tonight, even though it's hard and permission to be messy straight out the gate. And the other piece of the bio that's important, in addition to my commitment to community and children and families in the community, are my own two daughters, and navigating how to have these conversations with them and how to model being in the world as white women. and white young women. And so I'm on the grapple train with all of you around these issues, and I know that's true for you, Lise and Renita, as well.
Indeed. Thank you for you both for that wonderful introduction. If you want to be on video, I am very much I like to see head nods. So for those that are on video, I look for your reactions to kind of know if you're following the conversation. If I start seeing a couple, then I know that we might be hitting on a topic that's relevant. So yes, feel free to turn on video. I love reactions. It helps with the energy of the conversation, or feel free to leave them off. It's up to you. So what we're going to be talking today, our learning objectives, are to really understand what does it mean to be an ally in this movement. A lot of us have been reading a ton of material. There's this, I've listened, I've learned, but I don't really know how to have the conversation, how to have the safe space, how to create the safe space to have it. Am I someone who's doing microaggressions, and how to identify that? What even is a microaggression? And then how do I take myself further in this journey where it's in a supportive way, it's a helpful way, and it's not harmful? So that's what we're hoping to get out of the conversation today. So I'll start the question for you, Lise. D&I, why is it an important topic, and why do you think we need it?
Yeah, great kickoff question, Renita. You know, so D&I, and sometimes people throw the E in there, the DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you know, whenever we have these conversations, I start off with the place of saying, you know, why is it even necessary? And when you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that means that presumptively there are categories of people who have been excluded for years. And I know that that we as women have recognized that, particularly in a patriarchal society where the value of women and the force of women has often been disregarded and dismissed, even to the extent of excluding us from the life and breadth of you know, American workforce, American politics, and so on and so forth. But the other piece of that too is to recognize the racial history of our country, because when you look back at when Africans were first brought to the country to for free labor, essentially, there was intentional efforts to dehumanize people of color, particularly Africans at the time, in order to ease the conscience of folks who were manipulating and oppressing this people. And so even from the foundations of our country, we've seen that people of color, particularly Black folks, were excluded as human beings. Were excluded. We were counted as 3/5 of a person, not a whole person. And so when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it inherently lets us know that there are spaces and places where people are not treated with equity, where people are not included, where the spectrum of all of us who exist, we like to call America, the United States, a melting pot. But the reality is that we are asked to be here, but then also asked to assimilate or to conform to the majority culture. And so that's kind of where I like to start the conversation with DE&I.
Thank you, Lise. Michelle, this time feels different. Like, we've been in this conversation, for some of us feels like for many, many, many years. There have been protests and reactions to things that we see on the news and injustices, but now it seems like people are paying attention in a different way. Why do you think this makes it, but why this moment's different? This also is open to you as well, Lise.
There's so many ways to come at this, but one of the things that captures my attention is just even like a divine layer to this. Like, why COVID first? Why were we all put in a global timeout? So that we had to like settle into our lives and decisions and stillness, and something happened to each of us in those months prior to George Floyd's murder, and that wasn't by any means an exception to the rule or the only time, but it was a turning point for sure. I don't think we could have, as a country, had the reaction we've had and opened the space we've opened without the timeout we've all been in. And so there's a part of me that goes, okay, this is like an invitation. There's something happening here that is an invitation from God, the universe, whatever your belief system, to truly engage with this differently and to engage with it in a way that so many of us perhaps thought that those issues were not our issues. And I feel like now there's appropriate and positive discomfort that is making everybody stay in the conversation, and it's more uncomfortable to check out than to do the work. And the truth about human behavior is we don't change until it is more uncomfortable not to. And so something about this soupy mix we're in is making it more uncomfortable not to do the work. And that's my hope, that this truly is different.
And I fully agree with Michelle on that point. I've been asked this question several times on various panel discussion as to why this is different. And I think you're absolutely right that it is the X factor of COVID that literally made us stop being so busy and to pay attention, because there have been voices in the wilderness crying out about these issues for decades. I mean, you just look at the readings and the writings of James Baldwin, you look at the writings of Martin Luther King, and you see this issue of police brutality mentioned over and over again, but it's as if the world was stopped, was silenced, and as we know, quarantined, and had to pay attention. So one of the things that I like to say to folks is that, the enemy of forward progress is busyness, right? So you can find yourself being so busy doing a lot of other things that we can't really get progress moving forward. And I think that that's the question that arises even still, is that, is this a moment or is this a movement? And the difference between the moment and the movement is whether we internalize what we know to be true, whether we choose to continue to pay attention to the issues that are happening over and over again. Because the disheartening piece is that, you do have the George Floyd, you do have Ahmaud Arbery, you do have Breonna Taylor, but there are dozens and dozens more of unnamed people who fall into the same category and have continued to, because there have been other police killings that have happened since those tragic deaths. And so I agree. I think that whether or not this is a moment or a movement is up to us.
That is so great, because I think that that's important to understand that, to your point, James Baldwin, people have been writing for this for years. And I think that's one thing that I've been personally struggling with as, I've had friends ask for things like, well, there's materials that are out there that have been, I'm sharing articles from 2015, 2014, 2012, before. And so with that, now it's time. We've lobbed a couple softballs, everyone. Hopefully you're settled into your seats. You got a beverage. You ready? Okay. All right. So Michelle, as a white woman, how do you find yourself fitting into this narrative? What's been your journey? Because to Yulisa's point, crying out into the wilderness this whole time, what's been your journey as someone who's really been able to understand this movement in this moment, even before it was movement in a moment? What's been your journey?
Yeah. First of all, I missed the note to bring a beverage, so I'm a little bitter about that. I'm kidding. Okay, so I'm gonna, again, permission to be messy as I enter this, because one of the learnings for me is that my journey around this, however much it pulls me personally in, and this is where it's like polarities, right? How can both be true, but they are. This has to break your heart in order for us to do this work. But I can't stay in the space of shame and guilt and heartbreak and then also be an agent for change. I have to kind of acknowledge it, respect it, find a person or two that can help me think it through or talk it through, and then get to work. So one of my learnings about my own journey in this is to decenter my journey and not make it about me. And And we've really been conditioned as white women in the United States and in Dallas, Texas, to make it about us. And so it feels like a lot of narratives can go off in our head when we push against that tendency to kind of keep ourselves at the center of the narrative, because that's been normalized. That's one of the ways that these structures stay in place. Mm-hmm. So, you know, when I actively decenter myself and start thinking about the real punchline of my journey around racism, is that it's not about my journey, and that I have to earn my position as an ally in every interaction. It's like a verb, it's not a title. So maybe I'm a really good ally at 10:10 on Wednesday morning, and then at 10:30, I miss it. I miss an opportunity. Maybe I even act out in a racist way. And some people are gonna be like, wait, what? But that's the truth. Like, racism is in the water. And so the second I stop getting hooked by this desire to be the good white person, I can get to work. But if I'm spending all my time trying to prove to myself or other people that I'm not ... fill in the blanks, that's a space where we're the center of the narrative. I'm not ... that's all about me. Versus going, okay, this is systemic, it's structural. I've been taught narratives that hold all of these things in place. My work is to unlearn and relearn, and then filter my choices, my behaviors, my actions through this new information that tells history in a more rounded way that serves all of us, not just some of us.
Good. So, Elise, we talk about creating safe spaces to have dialogues and conversations. What does creating safe spaces really mean from your side? And Michelle, what does entering a safe space or creating a safe space mean from your side? And how, love both of your opinions on how do we create them and do them in a way where it's like not couched in a microaggression, and just kind of ground everybody in what a microaggression is. It's like those little comments that you just may hear or someone may say of, I know that I've heard, you're not your average Black woman. Oh, you like Alanis Morissette? Black people don't like that. Or whatever else. And it's like, well, first of all, or if you don't have children, you're not really a woman. So those types of things are microaggressions. And so it's things that we're just kind of conditioned to come off the cuff, but it's really like ow, chill, first of all. But in that, sometimes those come out in those safe spaces that we try to create. So I would love to have conversation around how do we approach that, create it for people, and also act in it.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. And I'm going to ask permission to be blunt, as my dear friend Michelle did, because we tend to have very blunt conversations.
So here's the thing. We have 237 women who joined on a Wednesday night at 7:00. Let's have a conversation. If you want to clutch a pearl, you can stay to 8, have it on mute, and get your meeting credit. But we're going to have a real conversation, ladies, because it's 2020, COVID's in the water. It's a lot going on outside. So if we here, let's talk. So yes, permission granted.
Love it. Well, I will say my dear friend Jerry Hawkins, who you guys have coming up next, I believe, from Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, he is the first person I think that helped me to reframe the conversation about safe spaces. And the reason being is because if we're going to have, the question is who are we trying to keep safe? And what are we trying to protect, right? Because the reality is, when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we inherently are creating a space where somebody is not going to feel safe. And the reason they're not going to feel safe is because we're talking about uncomfortable things. And unfortunately, and I think that, Michelle kind of pointed to this a little bit, we are very much so creatures of comfort. And we only like to be where we feel comfortable. But the reality is, and I'm sure people have heard this terminology before, is that you don't grow if you stay in your comfort zone. So in order to reach a place of growth and to expand, you have to go beyond your comfort zone. So the first thing I'd say in terms of creating a space is one of the things that we do in LSJA and Lone Star Justice Alliance is we create truth spaces. And so what we advise everyone is that when you enter this space, be prepared to hear truth. Now, that truth that you hear may be somebody else's truth. It does not mean that it's not truth. It just means that their truth is different from yours, and it is incumbent upon each of us to give credence and give value to another person's truth, because for many people, for many folks, perception is reality. And so when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it is that space of relinquishing this idea that my worldview and my perspective is the worldview and the perspective, and to be open to this conversation and discussion and space of saying, I'm ready to hear what someone else has to say, and I'm willing not to be readily offended. Now, and we have to distinguish being uncomfortable from being offended, right? Because being uncomfortable just means that you're sharing something with me that I've not had to consider before, or that disrupts my worldview. That doesn't mean that you're being threatened. That doesn't mean that you should feel scared or intimidated. It just means that you've been invited to think differently. You've been invited to see something differently. And I will tag team Michelle on that.
I don't see how I can add to that, Ulysses. I think that was so important and so profound, and the way you kind of clarified that in some ways prioritizing a safe space is one of the exit ramps we use to not do this work. And as a white woman, I'll say we're the best at it. And we do it in a way that shuts down the conversation. And I can say I hold the tension like I'm a therapist. I believe in safety. Like, I understand that people need to have a setting where their amygdalas are settled so their prefrontal cortex can come online. I get all that. But in this realm, we have prioritized the comfort and safety, in the tiniest little s safety of often white women over the actual deaths and lack of justice and equity and opportunity of Black people. And that's where you start going, oh, okay, so if we have to feel safe before we will have these conversations, and I will confess, as a facilitator, I have had that belief, and I have led some conversations around this topic from that space. How do we get safe first? That is an exit ramp. And think of how many conversations we've failed to have because we've used that.
So I'm gonna stay here, as they say in church, just for a moment. It's gonna drill into that. And I'm gonna speak my truth for a moment. I've had phone calls where I might have a white friend call me, especially when things are just really popping off. And for by definition, to pop off means things actively happening in the news. That is pop off. So when things are popping off, and so me sitting in my own trauma of watching George Floyd, hearing about Breonna Taylor, having someone on the phone crying to me about, oh my gosh, I didn't know it was this bad. Well, I was like, but what? I'm not crying. Why are you crying? So how do you recommend people like approach conversations with their Black friends or Hispanic friends, or even anyone who may be suffering trauma in a moment where it's not triggering for them, but still helpful? So what like personal work do you go through first before you reach out to somebody else to help them help you through it?
I mean, there's so many great resources out there that can kind of broaden out our scope of what it looks like to show up for the people we care about during this time. But just a few things right off the bat. If you have a Black friend that you've checked on during this last few months because you have some new awareness of how inequitable things are, and the conversation is maybe even any point about your experience and your emotions, that's a miss. That's a miss. Now emotions need motion, right? So I'm not recommending that you have no feelings ever again, but choose where you process what. And so if you feel stuck with shame, guilt, despair, then find another white person who is dedicated to doing their own anti-racism work and have that conversation with them, process your emotions together, and understand and respect that white women crying is a very loaded thing for Black people because we have made it a weapon. We've weaponized it. And so it layers on to trauma, and it also puts our Black friends in the position of doing the emotional labor for either our information or our processing. And somebody said this to me, and I thought it was so useful. This is a time when Black women need to be leaning into self-care, and white women need to be leaning into self-sacrifice. And self-care is one of the things I train about. I believe in it. I will, I get it. But that's another exit ramp. This is too hard. I can't have that conversation. I need to take care of myself. I can't stand up for that cause. It stresses my family out. Whatever it is, this is a time for white women, the women on this call right now, of course not all of us, but many, we are in a position to stand in this space of let us carry the load for a while. We have been blind to how much we've asked of you for hundreds of years.
And I'm just going to jump in because my friend Michelle, who I love dearly, has presented some really important topics that I think it's helpful to contextualize and look at it from a historical context. When she mentioned white women crying has been weaponized, it has been weaponized for years, decades, dare I say centuries. Just going back to the initial movie that really sparked the rise of the Ku Klux Klan across the country, Birth of a Nation, that was all about the big Black brute going after the virtue of this white woman. And at the end, she throws herself from a cliff to plummet to her death rather than succumbing to this big Black brute, right? You see that with the death of Emmett Till, where his accuser later, years later, in her 80s, confessed that she lied. You had a 14-year-old boy who was accosted from his uncle's house, taken in the back of a truck through the dark, deep woods of Mississippi, had barbed wire twisted around his neck, pieces of his body tortured, ultimately to be thrown from a bridge and died in a river because a white woman cried that he whistled at her or said something to her. I mean, this notion of white tears, and particularly like white female tears, and how it's weaponized and has been weaponized over the years is very real. And I think I just tip my hat to Michelle for lifting that up so that we could just share that historical context. There was another point I was going to make. I should have written it down, but maybe it'll come back to me. But I just wanted to share that in context.
Yeah, so that's a really, y'all are blessing myself. Okay, I love that concept, and I love the concept because I don't love tears, but it's an important concept to pivot to the topic of privilege now. And I'm actually—
You just reminded me.
Yes, and so because I look at my notes from our kickoff conversation, and I was like, we got to talk about it. Someone else just messaged me in the chat asking about white privilege. I'm gonna put a quick spin on this though, because we talked about in our prep call that privilege is technically kind of all of us right now. So I would love to hear your take on privilege in general, and then we'll pivot to, is white privilege a thing? Does it exist? So how do you confront or talk to someone who's like, I'm not privileged. I had to work for all I have.
Absolutely. Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump back and tag on Michelle's point because you brought it back. That's exactly what I wanted to talk about in privilege. And even the conversation that Michelle was saying in terms of like, oh, it's just too much. It's too stressful for me. You know, I can't really deal with that right now. That's privilege. Because I'm going to tell you, being Black in America, I don't get the privilege to not deal with it. I don't get the privilege to say I'm not going to have this conversation with my son about how he needs to interact with the police. I can't have, I don't have the privilege of saying, I don't need to be concerned about why there's 7, 8, 9 liquor stores on MLK, but we can't find a grocery store, a valid grocery store within 10 miles. I don't have that privilege. And so I think that what Michelle said in terms of, white women leaning into self-sacrifice to understand that in and of itself, the fact that you have the option not to deal with it is privilege, right? And even from the standpoint for me, I recognize that I'm privileged. I was just having a conversation earlier this week on a panel discussion about the paper bag test. How many of y'all know about the paper bag test? Y'all know about the paper bag test? So a paper bag test basically is this idea that the darker you are, the more inferior you are. The lighter you are, the better you are. And so even in the Black community, there were times where people would have literally a paper bag and say, if you're darker than this paper bag, then you can't play with us, or you can't have access, or you can't do this. And so for many times, oftentimes, I know that there is a certain level of privilege that I have because I'm a fair-skinned African-American woman. I also know that I really look, honestly, if my hair was out and it was curly, you wouldn't know what I was. I've gotten the question all the time, like, what are you? What are you mixed with? And the reality is that we all at some point have privilege. I have privilege. Now, don't get me wrong, I have had to work very hard for where I am and for what I've done. Right. But I also know that my background is not necessarily that I grew up in the projects. My background is not necessarily that there were times where I didn't have food on the table. I did, but I have been in communities where literally the only thing in the house to eat was a slice of bread. That's not been my story. And so when we talk about privilege, we have to recognize that all of us to some degree have privilege. So that was kind of my spin and take on it. And I had to recognize it myself. I had to absolutely recognize it myself and not be offended. I can absolutely tell you that I have privilege, and I can absolutely tell you that I have worked hard for the stuff that I've been able to be successful in. Tag Michelle.
Mm-hmm. I love it. And I would say just a 15-minute Google search, looking at Peggy McIntosh's work, just any article that kind of lays out what does it mean to have white privilege when you're walking around in the world. Little examples that are actually unbelievably heavy burdens for women of color. Like, I can go in any store and no one follows me. If I get stopped by the police, I know that there's going to be an assumption of innocence and generosity, and I'm not scared. The other day I was running in the rain, and it was such a downpour that I went and stood in the front porch of a vacant home, and I was totally not concerned about my safety. If I wanted to, I could run through the backyards of the people in my neighborhood and they'd go, I hope she's okay. That is white privilege, right? So all of just a quick Google search will kind of lay out what it means to have white privilege looks like. To Ulisa's point, it doesn't mean people haven't had to work hard for what they've gotten. But for me, the really critical framework shift was understanding that I'd sort of been told a narrative that it was like, how nice that I'm blessed, and what can I do to help? And that narrative is problematic. And what I now understand is that a certain group of people had power, and they've made decisions and put policies in place to hoard that power and keep that power, and that has benefited people who look like me. And so my long straw is directly connected to the short straw of other people. My privilege is directly connected to the oppression of other people. It's not random, and I'm not just blessed.
And I think one really good example of that historically would be redlining and access to home loans. You know, when you can say that you can go in as a white person and get a home loan in a particular area where they require a lesser down payment for the property than they would of a Black person if they allowed the Black person to even get a home loan for that area, right? So if you're not very familiar with the history of redlining, I'd say that'd be a great place to start. There's a great book called The Color of Law. If you don't know about that book, there's also a quick Vimeo video called Segregated by Design. It is very quick, like maybe 15 or 17 minutes, but it details that history very well. And so if you think about the ways in which policies, governmental policies, like implemented across the country, segregated communities, restricted access to development, to grocery stores. I mean, we're fighting the same fight right now, right? Like everybody's talking about the tale of two cities in Dallas, north of I-30 and south of I-30. Well, that's not just by happenstance. That was governmental policies put in place that restricted access for people of color, for Black folks, and granted access to people who are white.
So yes. And we'll be digging into that as a little promo and commercial in our history of race discussion next month. So be sure to join us for that with Jerry. Now we got some great questions coming through in the chat, so please keep them coming. One of them is, and I'm going to pose this to you, Ulysses. How can women of color, how do we fit into this narrative right now, and how do we lean in? I know personally, again, when things were popping off, I had to realize how much I didn't know and how much I wasn't taught. And so I had to do my own reading and like, okay, we're about to have Black History Month again in the middle of June for Renita. I watched all the things. I listened to podcasts. Like, okay, what are the gaps and how can I be of service? I leaned in by helping to create this. So what are your recommendations for how do we lean in right now as a woman of color?
Absolutely. I will say definitely that relearning place is critical. We have received so much misinformation about how we got here, where we are presently, that it is critical that we look at those historical documents. If you haven't checked out the Kerner Commission report, that is a great report to review and to read up on. If you haven't actually read some of Dr. King's work, then that's a great place to start in terms of understanding the structural racism that has created the environment that we exist in. I think another space too is I have always operated from a place of grace. So like one of our other values for LSJA is grace. So we have truth and grace. So we speak truth about the issues that are impacting us in our line of work, in our communities, but we offer grace in the sense that, we have partners who, although their heart is to do the right thing, a lot of times they say the wrong thing. And so in that, I think it's necessary to approach this work from a space of saying, this person is probably well-meaning. Actually, I'm going to plug Dr. Caroline Leaf. She's also very good. She has a book called Think, Learn, Succeed. And one of the things she says in her book is, we often make the mistake of assuming the worst about people in an interaction. And so if we take the opposite perspective and assume that somebody was well-meaning until they prove to us that they weren't, then we can have more graceful conversations with folks when we need to have these discussions. And so that's the way I would say is learn more, unlearn a lot of the wrong stuff that we did learn. As you said, Renita, fill in the gaps. And then as we have these conversations, be upfront when you start. It's like, look, I'm gonna be truthful. I'm gonna be truthful in love, and I'm gonna offer you grace as we dialogue about these issues. But please know that I'm gonna speak my truth.
And I think that grace component is so important. Like I tell people, even like the ones, I get a lot of phone calls, but for people who are wanting to have conversations, say, look, it's okay if you ask the question wrong. This is a graceful space. Just ask the question. I'd rather you ask it, me kind of well, don't say that to anybody else. You might get a different reaction. Say it like this next time, then I'll give the answer. So being in a place of grace, I think, is one thing that us as women of color can do. Michelle, we had a bit of a challenge to one of your earlier comments of, it's time for women of color to really be in that self-care role and white women to start sharing the load. Comment was around, like, now it's really time for everyone, all people, to carry the load, and recognize that sympathy and empathy are different. Simply recognizing you have privilege is a good first step, and enough first steps create a movement. The question is, how do we teach those around us the difference between guilt, shame, privilege, and active awareness?
Yes, I appreciate that challenge, because what we don't want is white women depleted and under-resourced and not able to be true partners in this. And we know that those things connect. The question is the intentionality. Am I dropping into self-care as a white woman as an exit ramp, or am I doing it knowing that you only give what you have, right? So if I'm resourcing myself because I know that I then am most able to be helpful, that's really different than thinking, this isn't my problem, I need a break. So that's the distinction I would make. And then the second part of the question, Renita, was how do
we teach people the difference between the guilt, shame, and privilege bucket versus active awareness? So I think we were talking about it before as, like, there can be a very disempowering narrative of, I don't know what to do, like, where to start, I'm just one person. How do you really shift that to an empowering narrative of, I might not know what to do, but do something? So how do we make that click over?
Yeah. For me, I had to take a look at the shame and the guilt and the privilege. Like, I couldn't unhook from it until I looked at it. And part of that looking for me was recognizing that I was putting a whole lot of energy into wanting to feel like and be seen as a good white person. And I was feeling like this unbelievable, like, rage against extreme examples of racist people, right? So it was like I was trying internally to create this separation between them and me. And a breakthrough point for me, moving from that guilt, shame, privilege cycle to active awareness and capacity to join, was dropping the narrative that I'm different than them. I just had to be like, okay, that's me. I am them. And yes, it's gradations, but that is me. I'm part of that history. And it doesn't mean that I owned slaves or that I used the N-word or that I would ever actively hurt a Black person. But when you're talking about structural racism, it's in the water. And so I can look at myself a year ago and go, oh, I know things now that make that not okay. 5 years ago, the list is longer. 10 years ago, the list is longer. My commitment now is that 2022 Michelle can look at 2020 Michelle and go, glad you kept learning. Whoops. And that just keeps iterating. And so I think the way that I was able to move, and it's not permanent. It's not like you move and you're done. It's a cycle, but I'm mostly moved, was looking at it, accepting it, doing the hard work around that. And then understanding that this is a lifelong thing.
Yes.
And I'm just one little tiny plug, that I'm not going to save anything. I'm not going to be the hero here. In fact, that would be counterproductive. I'm just going to commit to learning something about this every single day. And for me, I was like, oh my God, I've managed to commit to running. I've managed to commit to yoga and meditation. Why am I not committing daily to anti-racism? And so that can just be, am I listening to a podcast? Am I reading an article? Am I standing up when someone says something that is racist or is anti-Black or just hurtful? Those things. And then, just try to stand in it.
So that's a great pivot point, because we've got this question a couple times. When we are on Facebook or we have family members who are like, racism doesn't exist, and this can be on both sides of the coin. Racism doesn't exist. There's nothing we can do. They may post misinformation. I know I had to take a break personally from trying to respond to people and post. It's like, actually, no, this is the stat. No. I was like, Renita, put the phone down. Go watch Hamilton for a second. What we're not about to do right now is this. So how do you positively challenge? Do you even engage in those conversations with friends around the hopefully 6 foot apart dinner tables, or with family with masks on? How do you engage that dialogue when their views are so different? And that's open to the both of you on that one, because I'm eager to know myself.
Yeah, so I think that it's a personal determination in terms of where you are in your process, right? I think that Michelle brought up the key word is anti-racist, right? And what does it mean to be anti-racist? Just quite frankly, there have been conversations that I've been a part of, particularly where the environment was predominantly Black, and there were comments that were made about Muslims that was not accurate. And I had to speak up because I did not want that racist view to continue to perpetuate itself. And I think that is one of the questions that you have to ask yourself. And I say this often when my husband and I present at different spaces and help folks along their journeys of becoming anti-racist, is the question is for the sake of justice, what are you willing to lose? And that is always the question. What are you willing to lose and to sacrifice for the sake of justice? It's a question that I had to ask myself, because if I tell you some of the stories that we've had in terms of experiencing in this social justice, racial justice fight, I mean, we've been followed, to our home and around the block. We've seen and experienced a number of things. But for me, I think my pivotal moment where I recognized that, this is something that I have to be committed to, was when I shared the story earlier, actually, with our team, with our work team, was that we were at Original Pancake House in Dallas at Inwood, and I don't mind telling you, I can't remember the cross street, Inwood and Northwest Highway, I think. And my son was 3 at the time, and there was a family in front of us that was waiting. We were all waiting to be seated, white family. There was a white little girl in front of them, and they were just waving and playing back and forth. And the father, the little girl's father, when he saw it, quickly pulled his daughter around and sheltered her from my son. And I knew in that moment, my son, who loves people, loves everybody, and has since he was an infant. I mean, I think the boy came out smiling and saying hi to everybody. And I had to explain to my son, because he says, my friend, Mommy, what happened? What happened? What happened? And I just had to say to him, I couldn't say, well, baby, he's racist and he thinks that you're trying to harm his pure white child. And so I had to tell him that some people just don't respond to strangers the same way that we do. To people that they don't know, right? But it was in that moment that it became very clear to me that this fight for justice and for recognition of the humanity of all people is critical if I'm going to leave a better world for my kids and for my grandkids and for my great-grandkids. Because if Dr. King and John Lewis, who we now laud, pass the baton and we don't take it and keep running,
right,
then all of their work was for naught. And Viola Luiso, right? All of the many people over the decades who have been engaged in this racial justice, social justice work, it would be for naught if we don't continue the race.
That's so true. And I think, and just to interject for a quick second here, and someone else asked the question around, there's like so much to focus on. Where do you start? I think kind of the answer is everywhere, to kind of figure out where your what your talent is and what your passion is, because I was challenged with that originally when things were happening with, like, look, I'm not a walk the street protest kind of person. I'm scary. I can't get arrested. I gotta keep my job, which is also privilege. That's not my part in the movement. There are some people that are fantastic at that, but I can craft the heck out of a junior league diversity inclusion action plan, and that's my lane, and I can stand in it. So I think even like to your point of like leaning into, if it's you talking to your dad at the dinner table, have that conversation. Like, it's your daddy. Talk to him, challenge him, you know, and be able to do that, because there are people, the way I contextualize it, there are people who are doing a lot harder work, sacrificing their bodies. I can do as much as spend a couple hours crafting some questions for a summer series, and that's okay.
And I think you're right, Renita. The thing is that like, you've got to start where you are. And so if where you are is just gaining information, I do want to give a quick plug for a wonderful book called Good White Racist by Kelly Connolly. It's an awesome, awesome book where she talks about how she exposes the ways that white people participate and benefit from and unknowingly perpetuate racism. So that was kind of going back to the previous question. But if that's where you start, that's where you start. And like Renita said, so how many Moana fans do we have on the screen? Like, I love Moana. Like, y'all know her theme song. Like, so her theme song where she talks about how the ocean calls her. Yes. Once you get started learning more, there will be a place that calls you to it. Yes. And when it calls you to it, be ready to go.
So speaking of places that call us, I want to anchor that back to, and I promise you ladies, this won't go all night. I know it's 8. Let's give us like 10 more minutes. I'm bringing this back to the Junior League of Dallas. We are anchored in mission areas that support our city. And it's important as we are, you know, training up volunteers and going into these areas. How do we develop enough empathy? Not saying that everyone has empathy already, but how do we continue to build that empathy and concern for the populations that we serve, but also stay away from developing a savior complex? I know that's something you've talked about a lot, Michelle, so we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Oof. You know, the work that we do in nonprofits and in volunteering and charity, all of that is based on a white savior model. And so the more that all of the women on this call learn about this and start looking at how do we do with communities instead of for or to, and when we all start looking more at why do I hold tightly to this narrative about this neighborhood, and is that true? What else could be true? How does it serve me that I'm thinking about this group of people this way and my community in a much more complex, positive way? Like, the more this group of women starts to do that work, I get super hopeful, because I think if this group of women starts looking at transformative, equitable work in communities where the voices of the community members, the ideas, the solutions are raised up and elevated and amplified, and not only are we making sure that their voice is in the mix, but also their vote and even their veto. When all that starts happening, everything else will become clear, because that's who y'all are. I mean, y'all are like badass. Can I say that? Like,
you sure can.
You move mountains. You change our city. You have changed our city for years. And I did this too. I continue to do it in some ways under the umbrella of a white savior model. Like, that's the model that is available to us right now. So as that gets dismantled and new models emerge, there won't be a more impactful group in terms of spreading that and making it, like demanding it, than this group. And like, when I start thinking about what if everyone on this call just made the commitment to do the work, and then no need to get into fights with people, just the commitment that people are going to know where I stand. it would change this city.
Write that one down.
Absolutely. High-fiving across the internet waves. Yes.
So with that, Elise, making the commitment to know where we stand, and I'm gonna kind of bring this on home because there are beverages to get to, but give us 5 more minutes, ladies, we're almost there. Yes, us as the league we've done amazing work in Dallas, and make sure my dogs don't pull out my cords and this whole thing goes down. We've done amazing work in Dallas. Personally, as volunteers, we've engaged in blood, sweat, and tears. But yet there's still like this cautiousness that's there of we just a little bit slow to pull the trigger sometimes and not quite keeping up with the speed and pace that's moving, because what happens if we do a misstep? What happens if we do something wrong? What advice do you give us as women, as members of the Junior League of Dallas, to be able to have more courage and take those risks right now?
You know, I think it goes back to a quote from Dr. King, and again, that speaks towards the fierce urgency of now. And when we think about what holds us back, usually it's fear. And when we think about, and again, I'm going to reference John Lewis just because he recently passed, and he was such an advocate and fighter for justice. I think that the deep down resolve that has to be made is, does the fierce urgency of now allow me to be reserved? And the question is what do we lose? What do we lose if we fail to take action now? When you look over the course of history, there are, and I go back to what Michelle said, there are divine moments that, like the theme song in Moana, that call to us to take action and to move in that particular time. And the question is what do we miss? What life do we miss out on saving? What policy do we miss out on shifting? What may not come back around for another 50, 100 years because the atmosphere, the stars haven't aligned just right to be able to make this change move forward? Because the reality is that, you know, when progress goes forward for one group of people, it paves the way for others. And so these issues that we're talking about, they really circle around issues of supremacy, whether it's gender supremacy, racial supremacy, whatever the supremacy is. It's this mindset that something is better than somebody else. And the question is, are we as women, particularly influential women in the city of Dallas, going to stand up and say, enough is enough? We are all created in the image of God or the universe, whatever you believe, but we are created with a purpose, and all of our lives are valuable, and we have to make that determination to say, now is the time to stand and make this declaration. So I just center it back to the fierce urgency of now.
I love that. And Michelle, I want you to speak on this as well, but I'm gonna add one little extra tint to yours. If we have members that don't believe in the fierce urgency of now, or members that don't support a DE&I movement, how do you still keep a membership together holistically and move forward, though some people may not agree? What's the balance with that, in your humble opinion?
Yeah. So to me, there's no question where the country is going. And so as an organization, you have to ask yourselves, do we want to lead? Do we want to be dragged across the line once everyone else is already there? Or do we want to seal our fate in becoming totally irrelevant within the next 20 years? And if your answer is the first, that you want to lead, then there's a lot of internal work on bringing people along and accepting and respecting the different viewpoints and the different places people are. But in moments like this, an organization that has the kind of power that you all have to push this movement forward and change our city, if you get captured by the need to have total uniformity and total buy-in, you will not use this moment in the way that you could. Any organization that steps boldly forward loses some members and then attracts members that would have never given them a second look in the absence of that courage. And you just have to decide if you want to be the first group that leads, the second group that gets dragged across the line, or the third one that this is the beginning of relevance.
Whew, okay, getting all teary and wrapped up myself. Sorry. Yes, thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, I'm all like fired up. I just want to go do something. Okay, so with that, I just want to thank you both so incredibly much for this time and sharing with us, and for all of our membership that has asked amazing questions. And kudos for showing up on a Wednesday. I know the meeting credit part was enticing, but I'm gonna act like that y'all just wanted to come for the conversation too. But thank you for being here. Michelle, Ulysses, any like closing little nuggets before I kick it off to what's coming later in our summer series and back to Elizabeth?
Ulysses?
You want me to? Okay, I'll jump in. I want to thank Renita and the whole team from Junior League for, one, being bold enough to have this conversation and this discussion, for choosing to create a space of truth so that voices could be shared and acknowledged, and so that we could all learn and grow. That, I think, is a tremendous first step, and I am just honored to be a part. I just want to thank my dear friend Michelle for sharing this space with me as well. And ladies, I am convinced that if ever there was a time where we can shift the trajectory of not only our city, I heard this, and it may have been, actually, I think it may have been in our Dallas Public Voices class, but somewhere I heard someone say that they had heard or read something basically saying, so goes Dallas, so goes the country. And what a powerful time for us to take a stand and say that enough is enough. We are going to choose to do what's right, because the time is always right to do what is right. Thank you guys so much. God bless y'all.
Ulysses, I love that. And I echo everything you said about gratitude to the League and to Renita. And I will share any space with you anytime, and I will follow you anywhere. And I would just maybe put out there that anytime there's a movement like this, there's also a backlash coming. And so if these 234 women figure out what you stand for and how you're going to support yourselves and your entire community in moving so that you can stand up against whatever backlash is coming, it could literally be the difference maker if, in what Ulysses said, if Dallas can become a leader in this or not. It's the women. It's the women.
It's the women. It's always the women. It's always the women. So if you would love to learn more, we're going to continue our summer series as we've kind of touched on those pieces of history of race in Dallas. Jerry is going to bring it. I might suggest having a beverage for that one. But we're going to dig into some nice juicy bits of Dallas, including the history of the Junior League. He actually asked a really interesting question. He's like, so has the league dug into their own history? And I was like, yeah, we got a centennial coming up. It's great. He's like, no. The other history. I was like, oh, well, put it on a slide, Jerry. Put it on a slide. So that's coming in August, because I think it's important for us to understand we have all these mission areas that we serve, but there's a reason why we have to serve, because of the history of things that occurred in Dallas. And then in September, Robin Short, who we had a guest on here as well, is going to come and talk about how really to develop your personal equity plan. And so we're going to hit on the topics that are in both the books, White Fragility, that I know a lot of you are reading, and so you want to talk about race. We're going to bring home some of those topics for you in that September session, and then really help you develop a actionable plan to carry on this work, understanding that this is a journey. We will not solve this overnight. We will not learn all the things overnight. We didn't get here overnight, and it's going to take some patience, but grit, and it's also understanding the fierce urgency of now and pushing forward with boldness and courage in an empowering way. So with that, I give it back to Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renita. I really want to thank my very good friend Renita, my friend Ulysses, and I don't know, I've just met her tonight, Michelle, who I feel like we're going to be friends soon. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Couple of housekeeping things that I wanted to share with you. In order to receive a meeting credit tonight, you will have to fill out the survey. The link is up on the screen. There's also a QR code. I hope you're more technically savvy than I am with the QR code, but so just type into your browser the web address below. Please, before you sign off, if you're not showing up as a name in the participant list, change your participant name to be your junior league name so we can record your attendance. We want to make sure you're here. If you are on the phone, please email education@jld.net with your name and the phone number that you used to call in. Really important that we get that from you. We want to make sure that we give everyone their meeting credit. Again, I want to thank you all for just really bearing with us on our first go round into virtual training for our entire membership. I have to tell you, I was going through all the names of everyone who registered for tonight. We have got sustainers, we have got brand new provisionals, brand new actives who've been in the league for 10 or 15 years on this call. This group tonight really does run the gamut of our membership, and that makes me so excited for the summer series, and then just really the future of the league and where we're going. So again, thank you, Renita. Thank you, Ulysses. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you to the D&I committee, the strategy committee, or the strategy team and the education committee. These ladies and our staff as well. These ladies have been working overtime to bring this to you. I hope you're all really, really excited about what we're doing, and there's a lot more to come. So thank you all so much.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
This meeting's adjourned.